with Sharmine Narwani. She is here in Lebanon. I'm here in the U.S. The time's a little different here. So let's talk Geneva talks. Do you think there's going to be success? You have mentioned in the past that you think it'll just go back to the 2011 reforms.
Yeah, whether the Geneva talks are a success or not depends on the interests of the 20 parties at the table there. And those interests change all the time. They change because of politics. They change because of the military situation on the ground in Syria or in other parts of the region, like in Yemen and Iraq, for instance. So, a lot depends on the situation on the ground and the interests of these parties. We need to keep in mind that none of the 20 parties at the table right now are Syrians. These are all non-Syrians who have tried to put their arms around the Syrian situation, come up with a solution. The Syrians who are going to be at the talks are the Syrian government eventually, and then the Syrian opposition. And this is, almost laughable. And I'm not sure you can have successful negotiations when you don't have two actual parties negotiating. The Syrian opposition is pretty much fabricated by external powers. It's manufactured in various capitals outside of Syria. It's a very unrepresentative body. It consists of mainly Sunni males. You don't have Kurds or Christians or Alawites. You don't have secular Sunni. You don't have, of which there are millions in Syria. You don't have women. And these opposition members who will eventually sit at the table in Geneva are, essentially going to negotiate on behalf of the Syrian people, whatever that means. So whether the talks are successful or not depends on a great many things. And it does depend in some part on cobbling together a realistic representative Syrian opposition. But, as far as that article I think you're citing of mine where I said, after all these years and all these deaths, and these talks in Geneva, we may go back, right back to 2011 when Syrian President Bashar al-Assad reforms, the things that were unprecedented in Syria since the Ba'ath Party took power in 1963. And the Arab Spring started in Tunisia and Egypt, and almost instantly, I think, all the leaders in this region were looking at what they should do to prevent and inhibit these movements, popular uprisings, from coming to their countries. And like a lot of people, they were forced to sit down and tackle these problems. And Bashar al-Assad, very early on, before things had really hit in a big way in Syria, introduced a series of reforms. He lifted, I think, 50 years of emergency law, which allowed people to gather in public, among other things. They established a multi-party system. He established term limits for the presidency for the first time. He removed an article in the Constitution that sort of made the Ba'ath Party the center of all things and the leader of all things in Syria. He suspended the state security courts, which, funnily enough, just a few months later in Jordan, when the Jordanians did a reworking of their constitution, they added another security layer. They added military courts. So here, close U.S. ally, adding the military court, U.S. foe removing security courts, and look at the difference in reaction. So, there was amnesty for prisoners, there were new freedom of media laws instituted, and importantly, he said, okay, let's redraw the Constitution. And he did reach out to domestic dissident figures, many of whom had spent years in Assad's prison, his and his father's. And they turned him down because at that point, the rhetoric, the narratives were very much Assad's going to go. So nobody wanted to burn their bridges by actually engaging with the president and his team. So the Constitution was reworked. He held a national referendum for all Syrians to vote on the Constitution. And then it was to be followed by elections. Now, actually, if you look at what's on the table in Geneva, it's about creating a transitional government with reforms, ceasefires, which is unique to this situation because at that time there wasn't a need for ceasefires in Syria, and followed by constitutional changes and elections. So we're essentially going to go back to what was being tabled in early 2011 by the Syrian government because there was plenty there. Now, why did those gather steam? Why didn't they take hold? Well, I argue in my article, where was the time? The moment these reforms started, coming hard and fast, you had media headlines and U.S. policymakers and some Syrian opposition yelling, "It's too late," and Assad must go. And basically narrative used very cleverly to undermine, using the narratives of the Arab Spring, so to speak, to undermine a government that was in fact trying to strike a balance with those elements of the population who had grievances with it. Okay, so Morocco did it, Jordan did it, but no, Syria couldn't do it. Assad must go, and it's too late in Syria. So I think, whatever happens in Geneva, if we do enter a serious process and there is eventually a resolution, that it will look very much like the kinds of reforms and the kinds of changes that were being offered up by the Syrian government in 2011. But there's so many obstacles along the road right now. And I suspect a lot of this will really depend on what we're seeing happening, week by week in Syria now. What's the military situation on the ground right now? The Syrian government and its allies have pushed back the opposition in major areas across Syria, in key in key cities and towns, and have cut off supply routes for rebels. So I think this promises a Syrian government-dominated process. However, if things switch again, then we swing the other way. But if there is a resolution at Geneva, like I said, I think we will end up pretty much where we started. And had we only taken care and paid attention and allowed Syria the time and space to evolve its own political system itself, we might have spared the 250,000 Syrians who've died in this conflict, the countless injured permanently, and the now, I think, 12 million who are displaced inside Syria or refugees outside the country.
You mentioned that the Assad regime was going to offer changes. I think quite correctly you did mention maybe Assad needs a new public relations person. I'm not sure that you said that was the general narrative, was that it was too late. And this carries into the Geneva talks. They keep saying, the opposition I'm talking about now, keep saying Assad must go, Assad must go, he must go. And this is where they say that the talks start. He must go. How is that even a starting point when if you were to get rid of President Assad, you would eliminate the biggest fighting chance that the Syrian people have to escape the terror? How is that a starting position, and how are you going to have negotiations if you can't even talk to the other side?
It's not a starting position, and I think the more the larger powers at the table, the the U.S., the Russians, some European countries have pretty much poo-pooed that demand now. I think some of the opposition, because they are a manufactured opposition, they tend to be Islamists or affiliated loosely with the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups like that. They are people who, whose salaries are now paid for by foes of Syria. These people have their constituents. They're not Syrians mostly. Their constituents they have to answer to. And if you notice, besides some members of the opposition who are saying Assad must go, and are being very intransigent about it, look at the Saudis. The Saudi foreign minister just a day or two ago said the very same thing. Assad must go, and he will go, or we'll force him to go. Well, what kind of Syrian process is that? So I think this opposition very much mirrors and parrots the views of its backers, which again illustrates that they're not really representative of Syrians. They're representative of foreign interests. But I don't think he's, I don't think it's a demand that's being taken seriously at all. I do think certainly the United States appears to be frustrated that this demand even lingers, because they thought they got rid of it, which was difficult for them a while back. It's just positioning statements now, maybe for some leverage, maybe pre-negotiations before negotiations, but they're not going to get their demand recognized for sure.
So you mentioned that's not a Syrian solution. The initial protest, I think, as many are familiar, especially those listeners in Syria, know that the demands never were to get rid of the president. They were for democratic reforms. I think, to my knowledge, we are the only person to report, and I wrote about from our source in Damascus. I've heard opposition people saying that they wanted top Ba'ath officials and military officials to be laid off and to be restructured. The bureaucratic policy positions, the people in charge of these, as well as the military officials. I had heard from a very reliable source that there was weeks ago people laid off. There had been attempts to restructure, and even Assad's cousin, who I'm sure you're familiar with, killed that police officer. He was convicted 20 years in prison. Do you think that these steps are going to help win back any trust in people that I'm talking about the president, that he may have lost over time? Now, not radical elements of the opposition, but people who, let's say, they support the state of Syria, but not necessarily the president himself.
It depends. I think for people who have remained open-minded in this conflict, they probably look to these things and think, well, that was a good thing to see. And it helps them solidify a new position, perhaps. I think there's a lot of, there's been so much pushback on those reforms. I'm talking about the early 2011 ones again. He at that point also fired some top officials, and he dissolved the cabinet and the parliament, and and so forth. And people dissidents tended to look at these measures as being cosmetic and for public relations purposes. The Syrians are very bad at propaganda, and I'm not using propaganda in its negative connotation here. I mean propaganda in terms of disseminating information, putting their message forth, like a company does, a government. Yeah, the Syrian government.
They need a new public relations person.
Well, it's not just that. They need a team to disseminate
their views, their value propositions. If you have value propositions, let's hear it. Let's not hear it with pathetic music streaming in the background and nationalistic visuals. People want to hear things. It's not just Syria, by the way. I mean, we get this in the United States too, right? I mean, after 9/11, it was just death by dramatic visuals, anyways, I agree that, the Syrians need to do something about, conveying their value propositions, if they have them, to their constituents, to their public. As far as whether opposition people or dissidents would see the firing of top officials, restructuring of government as a positive thing, absolutely not. Many Syrians in the opposition wanted Assad to go at any cost. And we've heard statements from some of these individuals saying, let Syria burn, but Assad needs to go. We don't care if every Syrian dies, but Assad needs to go. That kind of rhetoric. They ignored his reforms. These people militarized the conflict. They sought foreign patronage. These people did not have democratic aspirations. For these kind of opposition members, this was a power grab, and we've seen, there's a different kind of opposition. In my article, I actually call people with genuine aspirations and who were wanting to work collectively with their government or elements of the government to evolve their political system and create a new Syria. I call them dissidents just because I had to separate them from this word opposition. The Syrian opposition is now almost completely associated in people's minds with this trumped up, fabricated, foreign manufactured opposition that's sitting in Geneva today. Now that opposition, like I said, is out for a power grab, and you can see this in the way they've evolved. The fact that they were foreign backed, they took, dollars for their service. The fact that they supported sanctions against the country, which made the common Syrians suffer more than it made the government suffer. The fact that they backed the militarization of the conflict. The fact that they are, Islamists, almost entirely, religious Sunni, almost entirely, the intransigence we're seeing from them, the fact that they're non-representative, you don't have the minorities in Syria, the considerable minorities in Syria represented among that opposition. You don't have half of Syria's population, the women. This is a one color opposition, and they're backed by Wahhabi trends in this region where power tends to be centered in the hands of one family or a very, very small elite. So I don't think any of that type of opposition would care, would give two hoots if the Assad government actually made serious moves to restructure themselves, and I think they know that. I think the government knows that, which is probably why we haven't seen very far-reaching restructuring as well, where it may have saved them at some point. They saw the pushback they were getting. They saw the narratives that were coming. But these are positive signs. I mean, the incident you mentioned about the Assad cousin who killed, I think it was a Syrian military officer, with a substantial fighting record, who was an Alawite too. I think people do look at things like that and say, well, thank goodness, maybe there's a possibility.
I think the narrative personally is starting to switch, and I think it's very self-evident by the fact that the narrative has changed. Back in the day, you would see people, and ironically, the only person to my knowledge that does it that's on this stage trying to be America's president is Hillary Clinton. She's the only person that still says we need to back the moderate rebels. Every other person has been saying we need to support the Kurds. I think that the fact that the rhetoric has changed from we need to support the rebels, and all of that, to now we need to support the Kurds, and it seems as though the people that want to throw money at this situation in America are distancing themselves from the rebel groups. John Kerry has been more open now to supporting Russian actions in Syria. Do you think that this constant narrative change in this almost schizophrenic American policy in Syria, one day saying we're going to support the rebels, next saying, okay, we're going to focus our support for the Kurds, the next saying, okay, we're going to open up to Moscow more and say, we're going to fight you, or to start, not fight you, fight with you against ISIS. Do you think that this shows how impotent the American policy in Syria has been so far?
Yeah, I think the narrative changes have come because U.S. Foreign policy, like many domestic policies, is very short-sighted. It tends to be in sort of 2-year election cycles more than long-term national projects. Somebody once called it short-termism, and I think it's true. Short-termism is something that affects the American body politic a great deal. And the examples you gave right now are just in the foreign policy realm. They've changed their narrative in part because this conflict, without having a clear end in mind, this conflict has dragged on well beyond anything they expected. They thought that Assad would have been unseated just by virtue of this sort of grand emotional sweep going through the Middle East and people from outside cheering it on, the Arab Spring. It took a few days in Tunisia, it took a few weeks in Egypt, or maybe it'll take a few months in Syria. It didn't happen. So I think the longevity of the conflict in Syria also forced the American narrative to change. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the U.S. hasn't really had a policy in Syria, cannot still to this day articulate a policy in Syria. The Syrian policy, the United States' Syrian policies or strategies or tactics are reflected throughout their policy decision making throughout the region, and actually the world for that matter. I mean, again, what do the Americans want? I've been thinking of writing an article about the U.S. is in a war economy because they spend more than 50% of their budget on military-related line items. How is that not a war economy? If it is a war economy, what's the purpose of it, right? Why? So I don't think there are a lot of people in Washington who could answer these questions. So it's no surprise that they can't answer Syria questions and they can't stay on point or on narrative or on message. But I think it's also really important to recognize for U.S. bashers or U.S. supporters in this region, the U.S. is not homogenous in its foreign policy. There isn't one voice, there isn't one decision maker, and it's time we recognize that. And it's time, frankly, in the Middle East.
Pushing its own policy, you have the Pentagon pushing its own policy, you have the State Department pushing its own policy, you have the Treasury Department pushing its own policy, and right now it seems to me that the biggest disconnect is between the CIA and the Pentagon. The CIA is very committed to overthrowing governments. The Pentagon as much as I hate to admit it, is being a little bit more prudent in these decision-making processes. And I don't believe, as I've said before, that the Pentagon, and I might be wrong, probably am wrong, that have not demonstrated any symptoms of clinical insanity, so I do not think that they have this incessant need to end the world. I think the CIA is just doing its job. Its job from the very beginning has been to overthrow governments. And they just keep trying to do it. You know, that's, so to your point of there's not one decision maker, you're certainly correct. There's a lot of decision makers.
You summed it up, and I think you're right about the U.S. military versus the intelligence branches of the U.S. government. And I think despite statements that sound, I guess, warmongering sometimes from some top U.S. generals, by and large, the military has tended to try to, I guess, de-escalate the rhetoric when it gets too heightened in the U.S. at various junctures during the Syrian conflict, when there was a lot of urgency being whipped up in the media for U.S. intervention. You would then get top U.S. generals step in and try to deflate that situation and stop their bubble. And I think it comes from the fact that the U.S. military is not interested in the direct wars anymore, the Afghanistan and the Iraq mistakes. They do, however, alongside the CIA, share an interest in covert wars and unconventional warfare, specifically using proxies to fight these wars, using, native lives instead of American lives, using subversion and sabotage. Alongside this, I mean, yes, we like to blame the CIA for all ills, but if you look at the U.S. Military Special Forces Unconventional Warfare Doctrine, which was leaked in 2010, and I think you can buy it on Amazon, so they've gone back in to redo it, though I hear from a source that the new version is not much different. It's a blueprint for what happened in Syria and what happened in Libya. They talk about, and this is the military, okay? It's not the CIA. They talk about, considering the fact that in almost all countries you will have a small sliver of the population that is very pro-government and a small sliver of the population that is very anti-government, then you have this vast middle, and the goal of this kind of unconventional warfare is to sway the perceptions of that vast middle into supporting an insurgency or rebellion. And there's, it's quite fascinating. There's steps, very specific steps on how to get there and when to introduce foreign funds and foreign weapons, when to introduce, a foreign direct assistance, which becomes public and so forth. But, even beyond that, so let's just talk about the fact that the U.S. is not homogenous in its foreign policy, and the military and the CIA and Congress and the State Department interest groups all have divergent or differing views on things. There is a larger problem in the foreign policy bodies in the U.S. where the Middle East is concerned, and I call it their strategic dissonance, because they literally have helped let loose Al-Qaeda and helped grow the Al-Qaeda franchise, because wherever the U.S. Puts boots on the ground, wherever it drones, Al-Qaeda thrives. Okay. And they know that. They continue to do that because destabilization is kind of what the U.S. does these days. It's not just in the Middle East, it's elsewhere too. And they have this problem. They haven't decided in the Middle East if they take out Al-Qaeda, like genuinely make efforts to undermine it or destroy it, defeat it, then Iran, right, grows in ascendancy, because Al-Qaeda is basically a Saudi project, or Saudi-Israeli now, for that matter. So
The strategic dissonance is Al-Qaeda versus Iran for the U.S. If we let the extremists in Syria grow too much, we can't let them grow too much. We can't because then Iran will win. Okay, but we can't really neuter Iran entirely at this time, because then who's going to keep radical extremists in check in the region? Which is when the U.S. decided to hedge its bets and really, really push for a nuclear agreement with Iran. Why else did this nuclear agreement come out of thin air? It started, the U.S. made, the Obama administration reached out to not the Rouhani government in Iran, the so-called moderates, right? But to the Ahmadinejad, the hardliner, back in mid-2012, when the Saudis started escalating in Syria and sort of unleashing all the jihadi genie out of the bottle. So it really comes down to this: the U.S. can't even decide whether it's Al Qaeda or Iran for them. Let alone what they think about the Kurds and no-fly zones and and which Sunnis they like and which they don't, and whether they're going to play ball with the Russians this week or next. They have to make some fundamental strategic choices before they can approach anything anywhere in the world.
You mentioned the Kurds, and I want to go back to the Geneva talks a little bit here, and just wind us back in that direction. But if the narrative, as I'm seeing it, is going with pretty much everybody who is trying to be commander-in-chief of the military right now, the direction is going to supporting the Kurds. If that is true, and Obama has been saying the same thing, if we're in a position where in the United States we're trying to help the Kurds fight ISIS, why are we not trying harder to have them in the peace talks?
I think that, the U.S. Kurdish policy is opportunistic. The Kurds are yet another group that the U.S. has globbed onto, where the U.S. could turn on them any second, kind of like with the Kurds and the Shia in Iraq, asking them to rise up against Saddam Hussein, then dropping them like a hot potato. The Kurds are used opportunistically by the U.S. There is some longer-term strategic value for some people in the U.S. government where the Kurds are concerned. I don't know if you've ever seen, Brad, that map that came out from, I guess, a U.S. military officer put together this map of what the Middle East could look like, and it's sort of around it. It's quite an interesting map. It tells a lot about possibilities, right? That the U.S. does consider, because they like to do that. They like to workshop things, and they like to put things, through exercises and processes. The State Department does it, but nobody does it as much and as well as the military. And actually, the U.S. military does challenge its thinking quite a bit by bringing in people who don't think their way to challenge their conceptions of things. So you can see that this map doesn't necessarily represent an absolute U.S. foreign policy goal, but it could represent a U.S. foreign policy goal. And this map shows a reduced, geographically speaking, a reduced Iran, a reduced Iraq, a reduced Syria, and a reduced Turkey. In its place, you have a landmass called Free Kurdistan that borders all four of those countries, all four being countries where there are significant Kurdish population, and in the minority, obviously. So now, one thing we've learned, one thing I've written about as well, during this conflict, if there was some kind of floating objective, it's a long-term policy that we had even before George W. Bush, which was to weaken the resistance axis. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Syria at that point, though Hamas is pretty much dropped out since. What happened when he went, the Americans went into Iraq was they kind of handed Iraq to the Iranians, not to the Iranians directly, but Iraq now was open to being part of Iran's sphere of influence, part of Iran's strategic depth in the region, where it absolutely didn't have that before. And now suddenly you had a line all the way from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Palestine, okay? Or Israel, as some would call it. And so when the Syrian project began, to undermine the Syrian government in 2011, one of the ideas was, well, if we could do regime change, we get rid of Assad and we put in someone who represents our views more favorably, and we cut that resistance axis, okay? When that failed to happen, then they developed this idea, which I think was always on the table, to create a buffer, a Sunni buffer between the part of Iraq and the part of Syria where the two countries border each other, right? And that would cut the line from Iran to Palestine. Now, then, Washington got worried about the explosion of the jihadi threat and the fact that it was coming back to Western Europe and even potentially North America. And so they started dealing with Iran to help counter the jihadi threat on the border and minimize it, contain it somehow. They didn't really want them to go away because it was a good, useful buffer, but they needed to contain them. And then the Kurds come into the picture there because the Kurds are actually on the northeastern side they're across the whole north of Syria, the Turkish border leading to the Iraqi border. And, the Kurds, if they could help the Kurds enough and beef them up enough and, push for Kurdish autonomy in a sort of broken up Syria, then the Kurds in Syria could act like the Barzani Kurds in Iraq have acted for the U.S., right? A buffer, a pro-U.S. buffer, to continue to weaken the state, to act in American interests, etc. So, the Kurds have utility right now. The delicate, difficult situation for the U.S., of course, is the fact that Turkey has a very hostile relationship with its Kurds, though it had sort of stemmed that trend in recent years. With the Syrian conflict, the Kurdish problem has blown up for the Turks. For the Turks to see Kurdish autonomy in the north of Syria, right, just to the south of Turkey, has been frightening. And this kind of thinking and freedom and whatever will influence Turkish Kurds. So of course the Turks have been pushing back heavily on the Americans to not support the Kurds. The Americans don't want to disappoint or upset their NATO ally in Turkey. So it's been a very delicate game for the Americans to balance. So the Kurds have utility in some respect, and they bring some disadvantages to the table in other respects. But I always say if American policy, because there really isn't one specific one, Americans like to have as many cards on their table as possible. They are opportunistic. They can find ways to gain from almost all scenarios.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Turkey is saying, don't help the Kurds, the United States, members or factions of the United States, you might call it. They are pressing heavily to support the Kurds. One real contradiction to that point that I noticed is that the United States, for example, is going to help PYD, but they won't help PKK. But PYD is a huge ally to PKK, obviously. And then at that point, it's almost kind of antithetical that if you were going to say, let's help the Kurds, you're not going to help all Kurds, right? You're not going to help PKK. You label it as a terrorist organization through intense Turkish lobbying. So then at that point, you're pretty much just doing half of both of your goals. You're doing half of supporting the Kurds, and then you're doing half of making Turkey happy,
Yes, but that is U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell, isn't it? It's half-assed, you know. So like I was saying about the strategic dissonance with Al-Qaeda versus Iran or Sunni extremism versus Iran, it's the same thing with the Kurds, you know. They're going to pick their Kurds like they pick their Iraqis, like they pick their Syrians, like they pick their Iranians. You know, now they're supporting the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, the Iranian terrorist organization, the anti-Iranian terrorist organization, that was on the U.S. State Department's list of, terror groups for many, many years, and they delisted them. I think it was in 2012. So like I said, it goes back to the fact that the U.S. likes to have all cards on the table. It plays its hand whenever it sees an opportunity or an advantage, which speaks to the short-termism in U.S. foreign policy. Today they're supporting the Kurds. Tomorrow they'll mow them down. I constantly now point out on Twitter every time, you know, now that the Americans are leaving their so-called moderate rebels to die in the field, right? With hardly a word, all right? And certainly no arms flowing, to them, I remind people on Twitter in this region that, the U.S. will always let you down. Why do you even trust in it anymore?
I've heard from rebels on the Latakia front who I've talked to in passing, and they express extreme outrage to the point that you just made. They say that the quote, well, I'm paraphrasing, that the United States is helping Assad, and he said that they are delaying the victory of the rebels. I don't know that the rebels would win, but that's what he said. Now, to your point about the Kurds, you know, you probably know as well as I do that the Kurds have traditionally been disposable to them. You know, the United States supported Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons against them quite some time ago. Now, you mentioned the terror list, and I want to talk about that a little bit. The terror list, to me, is not a terror list. It's more or less, it's kind of like a political hit list, and it's incredibly arbitrary. Hezbollah's on there, for example, who has never even positioned themselves in an attempt to attack, you know, the United States ever. I know that the people in Chiapas, the native Maya, what are they called? The Zapatista National Liberation Front, they were a terrorist organization. I believe they still are. And they've never one time tried to attack the United States. I don't believe they've killed anybody ever. I think that the overthrow of that territory in Mexico was bloodless. The only thing that they've done have expressed, I'm talking about the movement in Mexico now, the only thing that they have expressed discontent with in America is the insane trade agreements. So because this organization then disagrees with NAFTA, and now we call them in America a terrorist organization. So to me, it's not even a terror list. Now, obviously there are some terror groups on there, but for the most part, it's like a political hit list.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And today, you know, that list is an important way to formalize officially, a U.S. policy objective, okay, to marginalize, adversaries, or political adversaries, and do what they're doing, like with sanctions. I mean, I was talking to a very, very senior central banker in a Middle East state, someone who I would characterize as pro-American, pro-West, who actually used the term, the new tools of imperialism for the kinds of sanctions that were taking place, not against adversarial states, but also against Western corporations who engaged with any of
the folks or groups or states on what you call the U.S.'s political hit list, So these terrorism lists are just ways to formalize, and begin a process of punishing, anyone who has any dealings with these groups. And the tools are, these financial tools, as long as there is a U.S. And dollar-dominated global economic and financial system, are very handy. But even that is shifting, I think, as the U.S. hegemony wanes, U.S. prominence, dominance wanes globally. I think we're going to see some real changes in the global financial system as well.
Thank you so much for coming on our podcast. I really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure. It's very nice to talk with you, Brad. Thank you for having me.